This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Tonight we'll be looking into the report on Russian bounties for U.S. soldiers, how black professionals in NASCAR are trying to change the sport from the inside out, and why a contingent of people are pushing to decriminalize magic mushrooms. And you get to start your week with me, so lucky you. Let's jump right in. A Supreme Court ruling today struck down a restrictive abortion law in Louisiana in a decision that will fend off attempts to limit access to abortions. The now void measure would have required abortion doctors to have admitting privileges at hospitals within 30 miles of a clinic. With a 5-4 majority, Chief Justice John Roberts joined the 4 other liberal justices in the ruling. The opinion referred to a 2016 ruling which struck down a similar law in Texas, calling that unconstitutional too. At least a dozen states are walking back reopenings as the country gears up to celebrate Independence Day while also dealing with a new spike in COVID cases. Over the weekend, new cases continue to surge across the South and West. To avoid the crowds seen around Memorial Day, Miami and several counties in Florida already closed their beaches. In Houston, there's a growing fear that hospitals could soon be overwhelmed.
We need to understand that COVID-19 has taken a very swift and very dangerous turn in Texas over just the past few weeks.
The show will not go on, at least not this year. Today, Broadway announced it will be suspending performances in New York until 2021. Not a huge surprise given the plunge in tourism and the general uneasiness about crowds. So basically, Hamilton on streaming is all we're gonna see on Broadway through the rest of the year. There are decades of history and conflict between the US and Russia in Afghanistan, and this weekend gave us a new development. Reports that Russia's military offered money to Taliban fighters as a reward for killing soldiers from the US and the United Kingdom. As Newsy's Sasha Ingber shows us, the fallout from that bombshell report is only just starting to play out.
Questions are mounting after a bombshell report that a Russian military intelligence unit paid the Taliban bounty to kill U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan.
The big picture here is that Russia hasn't been deterred in any way, and in fact has become far more aggressive in terms of its subversive activities, hybrid war style activities against the United States and our allies.
Looming over the report, concerns about how much President Donald Trump knew, why, and when. The New York Times reported that alerts on the ground started as early as January, with a high-level meeting convening at the White House in March. The president denied ever being briefed and likened the report to another possible Russia hoax. In a letter to the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi urged answers to why the president and Congress weren't briefed.
You would think that the minute the president heard of it, he would want to know more instead of denying that he knew anything.
Former members of the intelligence community highlight the president's unusual stance toward Russia.
We have a president who goes out of his way to say pro-Russian things, who wants Russia back in the G7 against the wishes of almost all of our allies. President Trump diminishes NATO at virtually every chance he gets. Trump's attitudes toward Russia are not those of pretty much the entire U.S. national security establishment, whether Democratic or Republican.
In Moscow, the Kremlin spokesperson called the report nothing but lies. But the special unit said to have orchestrated the bounty program inside its military intelligence agency, known as the GRU, has been linked to other dangerous schemes.
This particular unit of the GRU, Unit 29155, has actually been tied to a lot of really high-profile assassination attempts in Western Europe, including United Kingdom, France, Germany, Czech Republic.
Russia's relationship with the Taliban is also nothing new.
Although the Russians basically just want the U.S. out of Afghanistan, there is a desire for payback going back to the 1980s and our support to the Afghan resistance against the Soviets back then. Ancient history, but not in Moscow.
In years past, Russia has reportedly helped to arm the Taliban, but it remains unclear how many U.S. and coalition troops may have been targeted or harmed in the bounty program.
If these reports are true, it could indicate that this was more part of an operation to destabilize Western efforts than it was about Afghanistan itself.
The fact that the Russian government is sponsoring these activities, that they're letting them play out in the open like this signals that Russia still sees the United States as its number one enemy, first and foremost. I think, but two, that they don't expect there to be any pushback or any retribution or any consequences for these activities.
Sasha Ingber, Newsy, Washington.
In this next part of the show, we prove to you just how much time we spend on the internet. Basically, too much time.
We dig a little deeper on the stories of the day to help start making sense of it all.
Sure. Memes and cat videos are fun, but actual news might be a bit more useful. Follow Newsy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get straightforward, opinion-free news right on your social news feed.
So you've gotten tested or treated for COVID-19. Newsy wants to hear from you about how much your treatment cost. Whether your bill was big or small, share your cost of COVID story by going to newsy.com/bills. We've been on Twitter all day and we're going to prove it right now. St. Louis is trending, and not because of their toasted ravioli. Twitter has been rocking with some wild images of a man and woman who confronted a Black Lives Matter protest passing through their private community with an AR-15 and a handgun. No one was injured in the confrontation, but the whole thing has become basically a metaphor for both the nation's current divide and for St. Louis's deep-rooted segregation along race and class lines. Beyonce is trending not just because she's Beyonce, but also because Disney Plus just announced a new visual album film from the artist, dropping July 31st. Yet, just when you were ready to pause that subscription until The Mandalorian Season 2 delivered more Baby Yoda, Disney Plus comes out with another big swing.
The ancestors never left you.
The visual album is inspired by Beyonce's work on the new Lion King movie, hence the Disney connection. It'll feature music from the film along with some original tracks. It's 2020, and seeing the term pipe bomb crawling down your timeline doesn't bode well, but it isn't terribly surprising. Luckily, pipe bomb is referencing a 5-minute tirade given by pro wrestler CM Punk almost exactly 9 years ago.
Oops, I'm breaking the fourth wall.
In the rant, CM Punk really goes after the wrestling establishment and touts his own record as to why he should be a star. It was a pretty legendary promo, but doesn't quite hold a candle to this gem.
But the cream will rise to the top, oh yeah.
You know the feeling when a stranger is standing or walking just a little too close to you? And you know how that's a way worse feeling in the middle of a pandemic? Cities around the world are keeping that in mind as they reshape traffic flows and street uses for the coronavirus era, taking a bit of space used for cars and giving a bit of space to make pedestrian areas a little less crowded. And some folks would like to keep it that way. Ellen Rolfes breaks it down in the latest episode of Newsy's Virology series.
Across the world, cities are preparing for millions more cyclists, joggers, and walkers. With fewer cars on the road during lockdowns, leaders have taken the opportunity to increase the space available to pedestrians. But it's not just Europe. It's becoming more popular here in the US as well, and this summer it may be coming to a city near you. Because let's face it, it isn't easy to stay physically distant on most sidewalks. But by limiting where cars can go and how fast they can travel, cities hope to reimagine roads for the present pandemic and beyond. Sidewalks are rarely large enough to support physical distancing. Take New York, for example. An analysis of the city's sidewalks found that 80% were less than 12 feet wide, making it difficult for two people to pass by each other. On sidewalks less than 6 feet, it's impossible to keep a safe distance.
I think many of us would like wider sidewalks.
Nicole Ferrara works for the Department of Transportation in Oakland, California.
To move a sidewalk or to expand a sidewalk can be millions of dollars per block. You have to really reconstruct the entire street, so it becomes very complicated.
Without wider sidewalks, pedestrians resort to the less safe option, walking on the road in traffic lanes, bike paths, and parking spaces. Which is why cities are taking cars out of the equation and implementing what are known as slow streets. By using temporary cones, signs, and some paint, Cities can quickly prioritize space for those on wheels and on foot and reduce the number of cars that pass through. In the US, dozens of cities have announced some form of street closures. New York City plans to shut down 100 miles this summer, and Oakland will limit traffic on 72 miles, more than 10% of its streets. And so far, it has dramatically changed how people use this public space.
We are seeing right now families that you would never see biking out on the street. You know, parents letting their kids scoot on the street unsupervised on these slow streets. Kids are playing in the streets in ways that they haven't in decades.
Dissuaded in cities where streets are generally considered unsafe, playing in streets is something usually equated with residential suburbs, a phenomena that greatly contributed to America's love affair with cars. After World War II, the opportunity to buy affordable housing prompted Americans, most of whom were white, to leave cities. Cars gave them the freedom to live where they wanted while still get to work, school, and shops. By 1960, 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs, and the number of cars in the US more than doubled in a decade. Over subsequent years, the numbers of cars continued to grow, and so did the number of lanes on streets, highways, and the speeds at which cars traveled.
Speeds are exponentially related to pedestrian safety. So at 20 miles an hour, if you're hit by a car, you have a 1 in 10 chance that you will be killed. At 40 miles an hour, that ratio flips, and you have a 1 in 10 chance of survival.
Which is why slowing down traffic is essential to keeping people safe on slow streets. In 2019, 2 cities in Europe eliminated all pedestrian and cyclist deaths after lowering the speed limit to 30 kilometers, or a little bit less than 20 miles per hour. DC and Boulder are following suit and lowering speed limits not just on slow streets, but citywide. While most slow street initiatives are temporary measures to address the new normal of the pandemic, some cities like Seattle have announced streets will stay slow even after the COVID crisis subsides.
We've heard a lot of excitement about slow streets and maintaining slow streets. That's probably the number one write-in response that we've gotten on our survey is make these permanent.
Americans will, of course, keep driving, especially with the potential risks of taking public transit until a vaccine is available. But giving cyclists and pedestrians more space will be important, especially in cities.
I'm going to go online shopping for one of those social distancing hula hoop things, so I'll be right back.
The number of African migrants arriving at Mexico's southern border has soared. Immigration officials tag African migrants entering Mexico as apatrida, or stateless.
We're working remotely, but our mission hasn't changed.
Newsy's here for you.
Newsy is here for you from our living rooms
and our kitchens.
24/7.
Focused on facts and not hype. Be informed,
not influenced.
NASCAR has been in the news a lot lately. The auto racing company decided to ban Confederate flags and symbols at races and also found the noosiest looking garage pool of all time in the garage of the only black full-time racer. But even though the company might be working through an ostensible image crisis, there are black professionals within the sport working to ensure inclusivity is fast-tracked. Austin Kim explains.
Brianna Daniels is quick. She can change a tire in a matter of seconds. But after just one conversation with her, you can tell she's used to the spotlight.
I'm actually one of the voices of our sport.
As the first black woman to join a NASCAR pit crew, Daniels feels empowered to share her story about changing the face of this predominantly white sport.
We have to be the ones to speak up, and to use our platforms to spread awareness to the important things that need to be talked about.
She's currently a tire changer for Jimmy Means Racing in the Xfinity Series, and she's been around competition. After wrapping up a basketball career at Norfolk State, someone told her to go to a NASCAR recruiting event on campus.
I didn't even watch NASCAR.
Her skills transitioned from the court to the pit.
You have to be very, very focused. You have to be poised. You have to be calm. You have to have that quick hand speed.
In a sport that goes so fast, cultural change in NASCAR has been slow. It wasn't until this month NASCAR explicitly banned Confederate flags at events.
That wasn't a great look, just at the racing events. You know, NASCAR is just not dealing with it anymore. So I really, really salute them for that.
Say what's up to the egg.
And then this week, NASCAR's leadership thought a noose was placed in Bubba Wallace's garage stall. He is the only black driver in the NASCAR Cup Series. The FBI said the rope had been there since the fall and there was no hate crime.
You're always going to have people that are going to test you, my friend. You're always, I've learned that from day one of being where I'm at.
That man has gotten so much support in the last 3 days than Colin Kaepernick has gotten in the last 4 years.
When you finally saw that the FBI said there was no hate crime, what was going through your mind?
That was a sign of relief. I had a little bit of relief because of that. I'm like, okay. But at the same time, even though that rope is, you know, part of the garage, the pull door or whatever to open the garage, why do they have new style ropes in there?
The event capped off an emotional week for NASCAR, one of self-reflection and evaluation.
We're taking baby steps, but if we keep moving forward and taking those steps, like I said, forward and not backwards, we'll be good.
Daniels and Wallace are success stories for NASCAR's Drive for Diversity initiative, which could take on new significance after this week.
Our owners, Max Siegel and Coach Phil Horton, they've been very, very instrumental with getting more diversity in the sport. You know, recruiting at HBCUs. You shouldn't just see a space as just one face, you know? It needs to be multiple faces to show that, you know, everybody's welcome and not just one specific race.
For Newsy, I'm Austin Kim, Chicago.
If you haven't done so already, go ahead and tweet at us using the hashtag #NewsyInTheLoop. I won't bite. I promise.
Native women have told me that what you do when you raise a daughter is you prepare her for what to do when she's raised, not if, but when.
Why are we different than every other person? Why don't we have the justice everybody else does?
It's hard to set up this next story without a lame quip about tripping on shrooms, but the truth is, some people feel that psychedelic drugs can be beneficial for health conditions, even if the government doesn't think so. Newsy's Zach Cuson explains how a contingent of folks are looking to decriminalize magic mushrooms in the nation's capital.
When you have depression, you feel so powerless, like you're out of control of your life, you're out of control of your emotions.
Melissa Lavasani had debilitating depression while pregnant with her second child. She hoped she would have some relief after giving birth, but a few weeks later, she began to spiral.
It was so beyond sadness. It was like despair, loneliness, isolation. I was just so miserable, and I was making everyone around me so miserable that I was like, I can't take this much longer. I'm just gonna take myself out of this equation and give some relief to my family.
Melissa found little relief with therapy and medication. She felt she was running out of options until she heard about mushrooms.
So we were like, well, let's try this, you know? Like, what else do we have to lose?
Psilocybin mushrooms, more commonly known as magic mushrooms or shrooms, are an illegal Schedule I substance under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Drugs in this category are believed to have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
When your life is on the line and you have to make a decision between breaking the law and taking your own life, and like, I loved my children. Just the thought of not being there to see them like grow up.
Melissa got the mushrooms from a friend and began taking them using a strategy known as microdosing, an amount small enough to not trigger psychedelic visualizations. She says she felt relief rapidly.
Within 3 days, my husband was saying that I was carrying my body differently, I was speaking differently, I was much more engaging, I was looking people in the eye more. It changed me so much that I felt so inspired that I needed to start this campaign.
These are petitions that we received today in the mail.
Melissa started Decriminalize Nature DC, a grassroots political campaign seeking to make naturally occurring psychedelic drugs, things like mushrooms, peyote, and ayahuasca, the lowest possible priority for law enforcement. The initiative wouldn't legalize the drugs for sale like some states have done with cannabis, just make it so police don't prioritize arresting people for possession of the drugs. selling or cultivating them for commercial purposes would still be an arrestable offense. A similar initiative passed in Denver last year. District Attorney Beth McCann had concerns that drug use in the city would rise.
I'm pleased to say that I don't think the things that I was worried about have come to pass. We have not seen a noticeable increase in cases being brought to us from the police for distribution of psilocybin.
There are other efforts to push psychedelics into the mainstream conversation, and they're backed by medical research.
Most of the research that's been conducted by this team at Hopkins has involved the administration of psilocybin, or the active ingredient in magic mushrooms.
Alan Davis is an assistant professor at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins. The center is researching how psychedelic drugs like magic mushrooms can be used as medicine.
We've completed several studies looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for tobacco addiction, as well as recent trials looking at depression.
Davis hopes that through clinical trials, the center will pave the way for a path to legalization, but through an FDA-approved treatment that could be prescribed by a doctor. He says the results from the Johns Hopkins studies have been promising.
We found that half of the people in the study no longer meeting criteria for depression after the treatment, and that's huge.
Researchers are still working to understand exactly what these substances do to the brain and why they're so effective. One theory has to do with something called psychological flexibility.
It seems like people who have lower psychological flexibility are more likely to use substances, for example, to cope as opposed to explore. And that coping is really kind of what seems to be the foundation of a lot of addiction.
What researchers are seeing is that psychedelics can help people get to the root cause, often trauma, that is affecting their mental health, rather than just managing symptoms. J.R. Ron, the founder and co-CEO of MindMed, a company working to develop medicine based on psychedelics, is cautious though, and recognizes his company is working with substances that have a complicated history.
The single biggest, I would say, threat and antagonist of psychedelic-inspired medicines is stigma.
I put the hot dog up to my mouth, and somebody started screaming.
In the late 60s, psychedelics were the subject of numerous propaganda films, like this one produced by the Lockheed Corporation. But before then, psychedelics were already the subject of extensive research.
There were over 1,000 studies done prior to the banning of these substances.
But the war on drugs brought that to an end. When the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, psychedelics were placed in that Schedule I category, meaning that in the eyes of the federal government, they had no recognized medical use. Now, with renewed interest in psychedelics to treat mental health issues, Ron wants to make sure the momentum continues and we don't have widespread recreational use of the drugs like we did in the 60s before they were banned.
In as many ways that we are in a psychedelic renaissance, it can quickly become a psychedelic apocalypse. And we need to prove that they work in a manner that our society and our government agrees with. We're going to have to focus more on, can we solve anxiety for 40 million people? And I think that psychedelic-inspired medicines might be our biggest hope.
Melissa envisions a future with community-based health centers using psychedelics.
I think people need to really reconnect with themselves and familiarize themselves with their bodies, their minds, and their spirits, and take back some of the power.
Zach Kusan, Newsy, Washington.
That's it for us tonight. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place, with more In the Loop. But don't go anywhere just yet. More top stories are headed your way right now.